Hi, my name's Jeff Howard, and you might know me from TV shows like Haunting of Hill House, or Midnight Mass, or movies like Oculus or Ouija Origin of Evil. We were talking about the absolutely insane way that I sold my very first screenplay and became a professional writer. If you weren't there to experience it for yourself, the back half of the 90s was a real Hollywood major movie theatrical renaissance. There were movies coming out like Usual Suspects, Three Kings, LA Confidential, movies that just helped define the era and were amazing. The script that Butler and I were about to write was not at all in any of those categories. We were more in the silly, something about Mary, back half of the 90s goofy comedy territory, and we lived there for a few years very happily and had a great time writing some really silly screenplays for some amazing producers. But first, we had to sit there at my dad's accounting office in his spare room in Glen Burnie, Maryland, and figure out how we were going to write an outline that was going to make Neil Moritz and Brad Luff at Original Film happy. We both realized that we knew nothing about movie structure, despite having spent the last 8 years working on trying to write screenplay after screenplay. So we completely abandoned the idea of writing an outline, and we shifted gears and we started to write a draft. We printed it out, we FedExed it to our manager, who was going to get it Friday morning at 10, and we crossed our fingers and waited to see what would happen. We were in our late 20s. We'd worked 8.5 years to get to this point. We just sent the most important FedEx that we would ever send in our lives, and we had 24 hours, we assumed, to sit and wait to hear what our manager was going to think of it, because it was unthinkable to us that she would let this go through the weekend and not read it on Friday when she got it immediately. It was just too sudden and too important to sit on. But then Friday came, and there was absolute radio silence from Los Angeles, and we had convinced ourselves of one of two scenarios. Either the script sucked, and it was over, and nothing was ever going to happen with it, and we were pretty much living out a useless dream that had run too long. Or she just hadn't read it yet. She was going to wait until that Sunday night read, and we'd hear something on Monday morning, or most likely Monday afternoon, or who knows, even Tuesday. And all that momentum that we felt from the previous week's meeting would be lost in our minds, and Brad Luff would have met a dozen other writers. Turns out it was probably more like 100 in that intervening time, and we would just be swept under the rug and be gone. So I wasn't having a very great Saturday at the time, and wasn't really enjoying myself. And about 7 o'clock when the phone rang, I was kind of surprised, because it was the Los Angeles specific line that we had put together, and I didn't know who would be calling from LA at that time, and I answered the phone, and it was Brad Luff, Neil Moritz's executive VP at Original Film at the time, wonderful guy who changed my life in about a 90-second phone call when he said, I read this thing. He said guys. He kept calling me guys, even though it was just me, because I don't think he knew our individual names at that point, which is, kind of another great object lesson in Hollywood. He kept saying, guys, I just didn't expect it to be this funny. It's really good. It's great. I couldn't stop reading. I couldn't stop putting it down. I'm going to send this to the studio. We're going to go send this thing all the way to Amy Pascal, who we knew was the head of Sony at the time. It was like, wow, this is crazy. Could this really be happening? Turns out it was happening. Turns out it just led to a lot more frantic, nervous waiting. We were way too scared to get excited. We knew that something big was happening. We knew that we really had a live ammo shot in there, in the place where the decisions could be made, money could change hands, and we could end up with a studio movie on our hands. And we were scared to death all week. Then my father had a heart attack that week and ended up in the hospital with a very severe heart attack. And it was a really bad situation and completely distracted me all through the week. And I really can admit that I just didn't think about Hollywood very much at all that week, if at any. Didn't see Butler, didn't do anything. Life was just in a sort of a very strange limbo. And then Saturday night, I was home, waiting just to hear some news from my dad, and when the phone rang, at first I thought, oh no, this is bad news, but it turned out to be the Los Angeles line, and it turned out to be my new friend Brad Luff again, who had called me to say that Amy Pascal had said yes, and that Sony was going to buy the script, and they were going to start talking to our manager and our lawyer on Monday, and the deal was going to be made, and everything was amazing. And it was the most electrifying tingle through my entire body that I ever felt, and my immediate first reaction was, my father supported me through this entire journey. This is amazing. I'm going to be able to now go see him in the hospital and tell him this news. Well, when I went to the hospital to tell him the news, the doctors told me that I couldn't. And I actually couldn't tell my dad, who really supported me through all this time and really couldn't have been a better guy toward me or my career. I couldn't tell him for almost a week after it had actually happened. And he could sort of tell that something was going on. Everybody was reacting a little different. And when I finally told him, he cried. And it was the one and only time I've ever seen him do that. And it was a really lovely moment, and it really tied up a whole chapter in my life of really pursuing this journey and going after this Hollywood dream. It came true 13 days after we sat down to write a draft that hadn't existed before, we'd gotten the yes that we had craved for almost a decade. Suddenly, we were in development with Sony. The script was announced in Variety. Calls that came in that day, the hundreds of calls, changed our lives forever. It led to dozens of meetings, to agents, to future jobs. It was a really amazing time. And it all happened because 13 days earlier, we sat down with no idea how to write a movie outline and decided just to write a movie instead. And suddenly, it was something that existed out there in the world. We found out that our executive also had one other movie that he was working on at the time called Spider-Man. And that was exciting. We were like, wow, this guy's going to be the biggest executive in the world. Little did we know that working on a movie like Spider-Man would take up absolutely every bit of any human being's energy, and that there was really just so little time left for us, and that we were really this distant second thing in everybody's mind as they put us through revisions, just like all the revisions that you think would happen. Ours was a script that was very strange and unusual love story that had a real beating heart at the center, and at the end, when some final revelations came out, you realized how sweet and wonderful the story really was, despite how crude and weird and awful it was until we got there. We were put into revision mode because we had one big reveal in our story, which we revealed at midpoint. In revision mode, we had the big reveal move to the end of Act 1, we had the big reveal move to the end of Act 2, we had the big reveal move to the very end of the movie. We wrote all of those versions over months, getting paid every time, and so happy to do it and excited to be there and figuring, oh, you know, they're professionals. They know what they're doing better than us. You know, we'll land on the version that works for them. Never landed on the version that works for them. Slowly died in development hell. But by that time, we'd moved on to other things, and it had served our purposes. It had gotten us in the door, and it launched us off into a really fun time that, for me, later metamorphosized into a whole different career. Working with another writer, and then working with Mike Flanagan on a bunch of movies and TV series, and then springing off now into where I am in collaborations with other directors who I really, really admire and I'm having a great time working with. I will forever be grateful to that crazy 4-day burst of inspiration, and forever grateful that at that time I had no idea how to write an outline, because otherwise I might not have made my very first sale. And the one thing that I learned from this entire thing was, it was a completely unrepeatable method of ever selling anything. I would never duplicate it again, despite many, many times trying, and I would watch my very good friend Chris Butler ultimately leave the industry over his frustration that he couldn't reduplicate this pattern. I've been thinking a lot about Strangelove over the last year and a half, because about a year and a half ago, Chris Butler, after a long battle with ALS, lost that fight and died, leaving behind a really loving and wonderful wife and 2 teenage daughters who really just couldn't be any more an amalgamation of the two of them, and in a lot of ways it feels like he's still out there living through them. So I miss him, and I've been thinking about this story a lot, and I hope that if you take anything away from it, it's that the relationships that you're going to forge in this business, some of them are going to be casual and loose, but some of them are going to be really the deepest ones that you're ever going to have in your life, and you should really cherish them and each of those moments that comes by, because whether you want to feel like it or not, the moments that you're living through right now in your career are the good old days, and someday you'll look back on them with some real nostalgia, which in this case literally lives up to its meaning, which is the pain of memory. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate having you. As I like to say, wrapping these up, I started doing these videos and the Zooms that we also do because after 8.5 years of trying to break in, as you just heard, and then another 8.5 years of working really hard to get something made, I realized that in that intervening time I'd made just about every mistake, personally, professionally, and creatively, that anyone could make. And now I decided to make these videos and to do these Zooms as a means of sharing some insights and some tips and some tricks and some techniques with you that might help you save some time in your own journey and let you get there a little quicker. I'm rooting for you, and I really appreciate all of you. Thanks for watching. If you could subscribe and share and all those good things, we'd really appreciate it. We're trying to grow this channel as a free resource for screenwriters. More hardcore technical stuff coming up, more anecdotal stuff coming up. I hope you'll stick around because we're really just getting started. Thank you all.